Yeah, at this time I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, but I also just want to make a comment that we really appreciate your taking the leadership with the Republican Study Group on the forum on oil exports and having an opportunity to examine that more thoroughly today. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope Secretary Moniz will send someone to the discussion this afternoon. Of course, I want to talk about exports like my friend Mr. Martin did. One of the things you talked about is that one of the good reasons for the ability to have oil exports is because you have a better matching of the qualities of grades that are needed by the refineries in different geographical areas around the world. And you didn't go quite far enough, I don't think, because one of the things that happens when you have that better matching is you have economic efficiency, and economic efficiency releases additional capital, and that additional capital, based on my experience with 30 years in the business, would go back into reinvestment, which stimulates the production. So next time you're answering that question, if you go all the way through that economic cycle, I think that it would be helpful. The next thing has to do with, I guess I'd call it a safety valve question. As you know, there are multiple versions of or proposals for oil exports out there, and some of them include giving the President the authority, the ability to suspend oil exports in the situation where we had some sort of an energy crisis, or if it's deemed in the national interest, or to be able to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve under those same circumstances. And so with those two safety valve features in place, doesn't that make it more compelling to allow oil exports?
Well, again, obviously more flexibilities are always welcome, but I think the fundamentals of the oil export question are those that we discussed earlier, I think, and I agree with you, of course, in terms of your economic argument. Okay.
One of the things that was interesting about timing is while your agency and others were working on the QER, the administration was also involved in negotiations with Iran. And in early April, your agency estimated that with a deal in place and the sanctions lifted, Iran might start selling us a stockpile of 30 million barrels or more later this year and raise its output by 700,000 barrels a day by the end of 2016. This would come at a time when we already have a global glut of crude oil. And so my first question is this: what analysis, if any, has DOE performed to better understand the implications of the entry of Iranian oil into the global markets on global supply and demand, global supply and prices, rather?
Well, I think, first of all, you stated the basic conclusion that one would see over some year or to 2 years certainly several 100,000 barrels per day, probably of increased production. That would go into the 95 million barrel per day or so pool. There are so many uncertainties in that time scale, in particular on the demand side. For example, a recovering European economy would put substantial then pressure on the supply side. Clearly, the nuclear negotiation is quite independent of that dynamic. That's about nuclear weapons issues that we think are important to block.
No, I do understand the independent nature of the two discussions. However, the impact is the same. So, I mean, the outcomes are the same.
Well, it's all supply and demand, and you know.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. And so, I guess under these circumstances, doesn't it seem like the President would have an increasingly difficult time justifying lifting the sanctions on Iranian oil at the same time keeping the sanctions on domestic oil in place, where domestic oil can't be sold abroad?
Well, I think the big difference is that we import 7 million barrels a day of crude oil. We are not a net exporter. We are an importer.
Right, but we're on track to be in a position to export, so it makes sense to lift the sanctions.
That's quite a few years away. I mean, we're still, even if you add in oil products, we're still at 4.5 million barrels a day.
Okay. So. No additional questions. Thank you. I yield back.